Earlier, Secretary Raimondo said, if we put women in charge of everything, everything would be much better. I couldn't agree more, but I have to say, if we put all the women who've been on this stage this afternoon in charge of the world, I am convinced the world would be a great deal better. So let me just express my admiration for SIPA and the IGP for the work that they're doing under the inspired leadership of Dean Yari Milo and Secretary Clinton. And we at the Carnegie Corporation are absolutely thrilled to partner in support of the extraordinary fellows, distinguished fellows, several of whom are about to join us on the stage. Andrew Carnegie was a very wise man, and not only because in 1913, he gave $2 million as an endowment to Columbia University. That's about $60 million today. But he was the wealthiest man in the world at the time, and he thought that war was a catastrophe and it should be averted. And he also thought that, given his wealth, he would be able to avert it. So he tried to persuade the President of the United States to prevent war. He didn't get very far. So he traveled to Europe and tried to persuade the leaders of the European countries to avoid war. And he didn't get very far. And then he traveled to the universities of the Western world and spoke to the students and told them not to sign up for war. Instead, they should sign up for a League of Peace. Now, there was one thing in common with all those students and all those leaders had. You've guessed it, they were all male. So imagine if those students and those world leaders had been female. Maybe, just maybe, the world might have avoided the catastrophe of the First World War. So women are rarely the perpetrators of global conflict, and invariably the first victims of conflict. So to help us explore these issues of conflict and the role of women in both conflict and conflict resolution, we have an extraordinary panel lined up here. And we have Kim Ghattas, who is a well-known author and analyst who's going to moderate the panel. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's my distinct pleasure to be here this evening for this next panel about women and girls in conflict zones and their essential participation in peace processes. It's been a fantastic afternoon so far. Like Hillary Clinton and Dean Karen, I'm also frustrated that we're still having to say women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights, particularly when it comes to conflict abroad as well. We've been mostly focused on the US so far and the economy here and how to be more inclusive here, and we're going to take you overseas now with this extraordinary panel. I'll introduce them shortly, but I want to just help you focus your minds on what it means to be going overseas to talk about conflicts abroad. It can be easy to think of them as, far away, other, inevitable conflicts. But I would urge you to think of these other places where you have conflict as not exactly the same as the US, but we deal with the same issues, the same systemic biases, the same gender pay gaps, and on top of that, there is conflict. And I think that the panel we have here will help us figure out how we can get such practical advice as we got from Secretary Raimondo, for example, and see how we can apply that to conflicts overseas to solve them and include women in the peace processes. I'll start by introducing the panel. We have the Honorable Henrietta Fore. She's a former Executive Director of UNICEF and former USAID Administrator. She's also an IGP Distinguished Fellow, and everyone here has an illustrious biography, so I'll keep it short for the sake of time and for a substantive conversation. We have Shabana Basij-Rasikh. She's a co-founder and president of the School of Leadership for Afghanistan, SOLA, and also an IGP Distinguished Fellow. SOLA is the first and only boarding school for Afghan girls. It operated in Kabul from 2016 until the evacuation and the takeover by the Taliban again in the summer of 2021. And SOLA now is operating in Rwanda. And Shabana divides her time between Rwanda and Boston. Melanne Verveer needs very little introduction, Executive Director at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. She was named by President Obama as Ambassador at Large for the Office of Global Women's Issues at the State Department in 2009, which she held during the secretaryship of Hillary Clinton. And joining us virtually, you can see him in there in the corner, is David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee and former UK Foreign Secretary, and also an IGP Distinguished Fellow. Henrietta, I want to start with you. There's a startling statistic that we have, which is that more than 600 million women and girls live in conflict-affected countries in 2022. That's a 50% increase since 2017. That's really shocking. There are two things going on here: more conflict and more women being impacted. And women and girls are disproportionately affected when it comes not just to the violence, but how it affects their health, their safety, their economic prosperity and participation. We've heard some very granular advice, some very granular approaches that people like Secretary Raimondo are taking to help women participate in the workforce in the US, for example. How do we apply this hands-on thinking to governments, international organizations, and NGOs today to change these statistics and that reality for women everywhere around the world?
It's a perfect question, and it's one we should all be thinking about, and I know David and I have been working on this hard together. So take the three areas that you mentioned. You started with health, and we've been talking about the care economy and about care blocks and about the extraordinary efforts of women to be healthcare workers all over the world. And as most of you know, the statistics are that 75% of the caregivers are women. I mean, we really, really dominate as women. So wouldn't it be wonderful if the world had primary healthcare clinics everywhere in the world? I mean, wouldn't this be something? It's very practical. It means that a mother could take a child and they could go to a clinic. It could be just a few hours away. It wouldn't be days away. You could get on a bus. You could have health care. Women tend to be the leaders in their communities for health care. They also tend to be the main people who take their children to a health care clinic. So you will save time, effort, you will help their lives, you'll help our lives. So health, if you could do primary healthcare clinics all over the world, bilateral funding, as Dame Richardson and I know very well, out of any of our countries can be focused on health and on primary healthcare. So that would be one. Your second area was security. And Secretary Clinton used a very interesting phrase. She said that women could be agents of peace and progress. And in fact, we are. So follow some of the initiatives. In Africa, there is one of Silence the Guns. And it has prevention of conflict in its genes and in its training. And they're using lots of women and lots of young people become peacemakers, to anticipate and to prevent the conflicts. And I know some of you in the audience, we have worked together, like Fore, and this has enormous possibilities. The third area you mentioned was economics. And one of the lessons you have coming out of UNICEF is the number one desire by every girl in the world is to get a good education. If you can educate a woman, she will take it from there. I mean, you've just got to educate the girls, and it's something that Shabana knows so well. But we have to try to educate every child in the world. We have to connect every school to the internet. And there's a number of initiatives doing it. UNICEF has one, along with GIGA and with the International Trade Commissions and others. It's extraordinarily important. If so, we could all be on the same level for being able to learn. And if you learn, if you get a good education, you will start businesses, you will be part of the market economy. But we also need to do something else. We, as all the bilateral and multilateral donors, We have to get public-private finance to work. We have not done this. I worked on this for 40 years. I don't know if it's going to happen in my lifetime, but we really need this. Women need this. If you're going to be part of the economics, the driving the progress of our world, you have to tie public and private funds together and make them useful. There's one last hope that I would have, which is that when I first went to UNICEF, I was in South Sudan. And when you're in South Sudan, you will see how the many militias and the conflicts have meant that the women and children have just fled. They've run away from their farms. They've headed to many of the refugee camps because there is shelter and there is food and there is the ability to live a life. Someday, and this could be a SIPA project, Karen, someday we need to move refugee camps into being new towns. If we could move them into being new towns, they will have all the economic vibrancy, they will have the health, the security, and the economic opportunity for women and girls, as well as everyone in the community. So those are a few granular ideas.
When you were at UNICEF and at USAID, did you also face this pushback when you were talking about women and girls, that people would separate, oh, this is a peace and security issue and this is a women's issues?
When you're working with young people, with children, people don't separate them as much. It's interesting, but there are some countries, Afghanistan being one, in which the status of women, what was brought up before, it's not the legal issue, it's the barriers, the customs in the country that can often keep the girls back. But no, in most countries, if you're young and you have an opportunity ahead of you, then the idea of opening it up for girls and boys is very much on everyone's mind. And every prime minister and president know that they're going to be voters. And so they'd like to look after that group of smart young people.
But unfortunately, Afghanistan is the big exception at the moment. Shabana, when the Taliban regained power in 2021 in August, and we saw the horrific images of people fleeing, they banned girls from going to school beyond 6th grade. You relocated the boarding school that you founded to Rwanda, and you have since also adapted the model to not only teach girls who are there, but also provide online education for girls back in Afghanistan. Lots of barriers to entry there, access to internet, safety issues when you're still in Afghanistan. How is SOLA working at the moment? How many students are in your network? And what have you learned from the experience of having to move? And what can we learn from your experience and how your model is working at the moment for education for girls?
Absolutely. When we arrived in Rwanda, we immediately knew that now we were operating as the only legally operating boarding school for Afghan girls at a secondary level anywhere on earth. And with that came a lot of responsibility, and knowing that we could never, under any circumstances, submit to Taliban's vision for Afghanistan, especially when girls and women and a lot of people in Afghanistan don't either. That a lot of people are forced to live under that regime, a gender apartheid regime, and for us, this unique opportunity to be operating still, to be educating girls, literally 4 days since we arrived in Rwanda, resuming classes for girls. We knew that it would be a matter of time before we would receive way more application from Afghan girls to study at SOLA than we could absorb as a one boarding school. So we looked at our strategic priorities and we arrived at 3 major ones. One was creating permanence in Rwanda, and on so many levels it made sense, especially when we talk about imagining refugee camps and communities as cities, right? So we're building a campus that will accommodate our expansion to more than double our student population in Rwanda. And knowing that we're simultaneously looking at a time when we will go back to Afghanistan. We don't know when exactly, but every single day we prepare to return one day to Afghanistan. The second one was, an example is this past year we received 2,000 applications from Afghan girls for only 30 spots in our 6th grade class. And you can imagine that 1.5% admission rate is not one to brag about. It's one to be incredibly angry about. It's one that is emotionally devastating to speak with girls from all over the world, Afghan girls who left Afghanistan for an opportunity to be in school, to study, and yet they still haven't been able to find those opportunities because where they are, they don't have the right visa, they don't have the refugee status, they don't have the financial means to be able to study. And so we thought about our second strategy, how, if we cannot bring all these girls to study at SOLA in Rwanda, how can we bring SOLA to them? And we're looking at two different possibilities here. One is an initiative which we call SOLA X, which we are soon to launch this month. And what it is primarily a WhatsApp-based text messaging learning opportunity for students. We have looked at a lot of initiatives, all well-meaning online initiatives to reach Afghan learners, especially girls inside Afghanistan. A lot of them require high bandwidth. You look at the videos, amazing videos that are prepared, but you look at views, there are 50, 100, or 200 views on each of those lectures or lessons and that's because people don't have access to internet. The other thing we looked at, and I think this is the genius of it, is the the possibility of Taliban banning access. And we turned to WhatsApp because they also use WhatsApp to run their day-to-day operations, and they previously used WhatsApp for their insurgency operations. So if they wanted to shut it down for us, they have to shut it down for themselves. And so when we launched this in this month, the idea is that SOLA education will be available in Dari, Pashto, the primary national languages in Afghanistan, and English. We're targeting girls, but the beauty of this is it's self-paced, asynchronous learning that boys, even non-traditional students will have access to. And we have to be honest about this. It's not a replacement for an in-classroom experience. It should never be a replacement for an in-classroom experience. While we have to innovate out of necessity that girls' access to education is banned, that SOLA X for us is about keeping that hope alive for thousands and thousands of Afghan girls who don't have the opportunity. I grew up under that first Taliban regime. I was one of the very, very fortunate ones who was sent to a secret underground school. And my parents did that, making me one of the very few lucky women in Afghanistan today to have the education that I have. And I ended up in 2002 attending school for the first time with majority of my classmates who were 6 years older than I was. And these were girls who were coming back to school where they had left off. And for us, we've looked at all of the previous barriers, the current challenges that girls have in Afghanistan, and imagined SOLA X making it easily accessible for girls, for families who have a basic smartphone, and let's say several daughters, and each of them can open a page, sign up for a class, enroll in grades and classes, request daily content, engage with it, take assessments, and after completing the coursework, and provided that they pass it, they receive a certificate of completion that will have a unique code that can be verified. And the next step for us is then to be able to work with international organizations who focus on providing access for Afghan girls in Afghanistan on certification and making sure that they, in the long run, can pass as a way of documenting their progress in school. And the other thing that we're looking at is the possibility of opening satellite campus or campuses in communities Afghan communities closer to Afghanistan. While we have this incredible support from the Rwandan government, there are Afghan girls that we bring from refugee communities in closer to Afghanistan where they don't have passports or they don't have the ability to receive passport. We partner with the Rwandan government, who often issue travel document for these students to be able to then travel from those communities to Rwanda. But we also partner with UN agency, with IOM, and staff members from the many different offices of IOM across the world who partner with us in chaperoning every single one of these Afghan girls who are admitted to SOLA today to be able to safely come to us, to Rwanda. And then finally, the other thing that we're focusing on right now is creating a really robust network of highly educated Afghan women who are going to be currently in the diaspora. A network of Afghan sisterhood. Right after the first Taliban regime collapsed in 2001, thousands of Afghan refugees poured back into Afghanistan. And out of that group emerged a group of Afghan women who were leaders in both public and private sectors. And these were Afghan women who had the opportunity to be able to study while they were themselves refugees, or to be able to continue to be professional women in these refugee communities. And they ended up becoming some of our most prominent leaders in Afghanistan. And we look at this right now as a time that we cannot waste. We have to continue to focus, and remain laser focused on educating Afghan women so that when that time comes, and I'm hopeful that it will come during my lifetime, that when we go back to Afghanistan, there are thousands of Afghan women currently in the Afghan diaspora community who are going to go back and lead our country.
It's truly inspirational, incredible work, Shabana. And I can also imagine that the WhatsApp-based education that you're providing is potentially a template for other countries where education may not be banned for girls, but it's interrupted because of conflict, whether it's Sudan or Gaza or other places. So definitely something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. You know, look, conflicts are on the rise, and while we're focused on solutions for Afghan girls and Afghan women, what we're doing with SOLA X is a model that is incredibly easily replicated in any other context. And it, along the same lines of looking at refugee populations in general, but particularly girls and women, we have to be able to look at them not as burden coming towards us or upon us. We have to look at them as wealth of resources that are on the move, that are forced to move. And it's certainly the case for Afghanistan. When I was evacuating our community, I ended up spending 3 days at the airport, and I firsthand witnessed the brain power of Afghanistan fleeing, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And that was beyond devastating for me to witness. And I knew that where I was standing, where I was watching them, they were going to pass a line where, for Afghanistan, they were the most wanted individuals and resources and people who were churning the Afghan economy, leaving. And as soon as they crossed that line, they were becoming the most unwanted people on earth, wearing one of the least wanted identities, which is that of a refugee. And so we have to look at it. We have to start to look at refugees differently. We have to look at these people on the move differently. We have to equip them with that continuity of learning. Institutions, especially higher ed institutions and institutions at the secondary level, have to work together so that the responses to these forced migrations are not on ad hoc emotional basis. They are not a one-off, let's open up a wealth of fellowships and scholarships and opportunities for these students from Afghanistan and then from Ukraine and then from the Middle East and bring them in. But it has to be a very comprehensive, well thought out response so that we can see these young people who are on the move go from place to a place, and their to be a continuity for their learning so that they can easily transition into...
And return eventually to build the peace. David, I want to turn to you. Thank you for joining us virtually. In the IRC's annual report, the Emergency Watch List, you highlighted that organizations like Shabana's are actually underfunded. And you have a rather shocking stat in that report that says that only 1.2% of humanitarian financing reaches women-led organizations. So not only are women the main sort of recipient of the violence in conflict, the first affected, but when they try to do good like Shabana, they end up being underfunded as well. What can the international community do to first take stock of this quickly and also address it very quickly? Because women shouldn't just be half of the economy, but also half of the solution, of course, and they can be. So how do we address this?
Thanks so much, Kim. I'm really honored to be part of this panel and need to start with an apology not being in the room with you. I just absolutely had to be in the IRC office this afternoon, so I apologize for not being with you. I think there are three important points to get to grips with your question. The first is that the International Rescue Committee, my organization, we are an international humanitarian organization focused on people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster. And we say that we cannot be a successful humanitarian organization unless we're also a feminist organization. By that, we mean that we take seriously the structural inequalities that face women and girls in the communities that we work in, but also take seriously the structural inequalities that exist within our sector and, God forbid, sometimes even within our own organization. So I think the framing is very, very important, and I'll come back to that. Secondly, I do want to just alight on the testimony that Shabana has given about the situation in Afghanistan. We have 5,000 people working for us in Afghanistan in 12 provinces. 2,200 of them are women, despite the Taliban, quote unquote, ban on women working for NGOs. Those women are a lifeline for the clients that they serve, but they're also a lifeline, an economic lifeline for the 3, 4, 5, 6 families that each of them support through the income that they earn from us. And Shabana's point about WhatsApp, there's a lot of evidence for that now. We actually have evidence from the Middle East where we've run a very large early childhood development program. We showed that using similar techniques to those that Shabana has used, that you can make a year's worth of pre-primary progress in emotional and social progress, but also academic learning in just 11 weeks of our program. So there's real potential. Technology is often thrown at children as an educational solution. That doesn't work, but in the right hands, it can work. Now, to your point about the funding and support for women-led organizations, if there was a percentage of funding related to the amount of political rhetoric on an issue, then funding for gender equality would be through the roof. But essentially what we're dealing with here is a massive mismatch between the number of political speeches and the amount of political action. This is all about political leadership. It's about transparency, it's about clarity, it's about consistency and follow-through. And I just want to give you one example of this. In every crisis response, there's something called the humanitarian country team that is run by the UN and its agencies. 80% of humanitarian country teams have no plan to reduce gender inequality, despite all the rhetoric about this. So that's how you end up in a situation of not just underfunding of local organizations in general, but of the underfunding of the women-led organizations. And in our experience, this is all about information that's secret never leads to reform. You've got to have transparency, you've got to have targets, you've got to have leadership role modeling, and you can then make significant progress, whether it be about hiring or it be about financial flows. And I hope that the IGP will make it part of its business to make sure that fragile and conflict states are not just marginal to the global political conversation, but achieve the status they need, which is closer to the mainstream. Because if we know anything, it's that untended humanitarian crisis leads to more political instability. And that's what we're seeing in many parts of the world, not least in the Middle East, which no doubt we'll touch on, But frankly, there's 25 million people in Sudan today who are suffering from an extraordinary political and military and economic crisis. It's impossible to get anyone to pay any attention to it at all. And if the IGP can shine a light, all the better.
Thank you, David. Melanne, I want to turn to you. We're talking about conflict and how women are affected, how they are first affected alongside children as well, whether it's Sudan or Gaza, Ukraine or Afghanistan. But there is also what happens after conflict, and that is the peace process. One could argue that perhaps if women had been at the table in the discussions for Afghanistan and the peace process, perhaps better represented, maybe we would have made better, more progress. Women are often excluded from the peace process, and yet we know that if they are included, the peace is more sustainable and more achievable. And we've seen examples of that. I'd like to think of Northern Ireland, for example. Tell us a little bit about what people are missing when they go into a peace process or peace negotiations if the women are not included, and I'll have a follow-up question.
Well, there's so much wisdom in what you said, Kim, and before I make an attempt to address some of it, I want to thank the organizers again. It's my second trip up here to SIPA in a few weeks, and these are profoundly deep and important conversations. There is a construct that's been put in place by the Security Council of the United Nations, which focuses on peace and security. And it's in the shorthand called Resolution 1325. That resolution has been strengthened 9 times over, realizing how critical it is that women fully participate in peace and security, whether in preventing conflict, in participating in the kinds of negotiations that Kim addressed, whether in relief, recovery, reconstruction, what comes after in that transitional period, but also recognizes that rape is a tool of war and women need to be protected. But we're really talking about women's agency when it comes to this resolution. And regrettably, the goals of the resolution have been largely unfulfilled. Half the peace agreements that are put in place are abrogated within 5 years. Many of the conflicts are recurring. Many of the genuinely important issues that have to be addressed are not addressed. And women are not present, as so often we had to plead for the Afghan women to be in one important conversation or another that could have made a difference. And I think when all the retrospectives are written, one of the reasons, if not one of the most important reasons, that we have what we have today in Afghanistan is the failure to take the talent of half the population and incorporate it. So what can member states do that they're not doing? What can governments do that they're not doing? Well, first of all, this is an evidence-based case. The evidence and data are there that show that when women are at the peace table, unfortunately, not as much as they should be, and there are cases of success in Colombia, a peace agreement that is slowly being fully implemented in one of the peace processes in the Philippines, Northern Ireland, and dealing with the Troubles, that there is solid evidence that the issues that women put on the table would not be there otherwise. Most of the conversations are between the men on one side or the other, the rebel groups talking to each other. And what we see and have seen is one of the first things they do is give themselves amnesty for what they've done to the women. That's no way to move to a better future post-conflict, clearly. So the recognizing the importance of this participation, issues like reconciliation, human rights, economic issues, bringing communities back together, being an honest broker, those are the kinds of real, tangible inputs women bring that have positive conclusions to them. So recognizing the evidence, I think, is clearly important. Secondly, understanding the role that women play at the local level. David brilliantly expressed the critical role that's being played. And stealing from you, David, as I often do, really recognizing the centrality of that role at the local level. Bringing communities, facilitating dialogue among them, understanding the conflict, having central knowledge about what's going on, knowledge that really, if there's going to be an end to the conflict in a better future, has to be incorporated in the discussions. So what you have is a bifurcated process. You have what we call a track 2 or track 3 happening at the local level, really, really important work going on, but it doesn't inform the formal level, track 1. And women are rarely in that formal level. So one of the critical things that has to happen is there's got to be connectivity between 2 and 1, and preferably bringing more of those women to the peace table itself to negotiate. Secondly, what David said about women's organizations and what Shabana exemplifies is that they are underfunded. And I agree completely. If we could take all of the wonderful rhetoric about how important this issue is and turn it into something tangible, we'd have countless women at peace tables. We'd have a much more peaceful world, it seems to me. And we would have plenty of resources for these vital organizations. That isn't happening. That needs to happen. And we need more women in positions of responsibility, certainly as negotiators, as mediators. There are very, very few, maybe 10% of the negotiators, and even fewer signatories to agreements. So this recognition of the vital role is another critically important element. The Security Council also said that governments should adopt national action plans to take the important work that this represents, implement it, realize it. And there are over 100 national action plans today. Secretary Clinton presided over the realization for the first time of the United States National Action Plan. Some are check the box. That's all a government can say is, I've checked the box. We have a national action plan, and they don't really do anything about it. Others are extraordinary. Governments really revisiting year after year what they need to do to better implement the resolution. But there is a lot of work that still needs to be done. Israel and Palestine, for example. No reference to 1325, no national action plan. It seems to me to really begin to deal with the dramatic absence of women from a peace process over decades, it needs to start soon. It needs to have happened years ago. But one place local peace builders are working on is a national action plan. Another area that has to be addressed is for this to be real in government. So you have a conversation about, we have a NAP, we believe in women, peace, and security, but it's not connected to the foreign policy. And it's something you mentioned earlier, Kim, where there has to be, Afghan policy needs to be women, peace, and security, not siloed, separate women's issue. Ukraine policy, women, peace, and security. Middle East policy. This needs to be mainstream, integrated, gender perspective and participation of women. Only then will we begin to get the kind of effective results that we need to see. And I think also we increasingly need to bring governments, need to come together. Finland and Spain right now have something called Commitment 2025, which is to take some of the resources, some of the commitments, amplify them by their coming together to really have greater impacts than going at it one at a time. But in the end, this is about political will. It's about leadership. It's about power. It's easier to talk about this than the reality of what's happening. And I just want to read this quote to you from a former Secretary of State you may recognize. She said, the time to change how the world thinks about conflict and how we stop it and prevent it, how we think about security and how we provide it, how we think about peace and how to realize it. And it's past time for women to take their rightful place side by side with men in the rooms where the fates of people are decided. And those are in negotiations to make the peace and in the institutions to keep the peace. And women are still not there in great numbers that they should be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Melanne. I'm being told that we have to wrap up. We could be here and have a whole session just about that. But I think it's important to remember that just as we discuss inclusive economies in the West, this inclusivity, not looking at the issue of women as just a social issue also in areas of conflict, but as really part of the solution about peace and security, and having women not just as, seeing them just as victims, but also agents of change, and empowering them and counting on organizations like David's organization to fund women-led organizations. Thank you very much, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you.